The characteristics of fascism. Anti-free markets. As has been alluded to several times throughout these videos, the fascists were in no way in favor of the free market. Central planning and state control of the markets were a key part of the totalitarian vision of the fascist future. All too often, fascism has been said to defend capitalism or the free market. Marxist author R. Palm Dutt wrote in 1935 that, quote, "Fascism represents the desperate attempt of the doomed capitalist class to maintain its power and overcome the contradictions by extreme violent means," unquote. Left-wing playwright Bertolt Brecht in 1935 described fascism as, quote, "the nakedest, most shameless, most oppressive, and most treacherous form of capitalism," unquote. Communist pamphleteer Ernst Lund wrote in 1943 that, quote, "Fascism is the ugly child of capitalist decay. Fascism is the last resort of the capitalist class everywhere," unquote. Even in more recent years, similar claims have been made, for instance, by Ismail Hossein-Zadeh, also by the YouTuber Finnish Bolshevik. There's also articles by Samir Amin. There's also articles by Ron Jacobs and Jennifer Abbott and Mark Akbar. There's also the example of Oliver Stone's documentary series, The Untold History of the United States. All of them make a similar claim. However common this claim is, it is nevertheless unsubstantiated. In no conceivable way can fascism be said to have been a free market ideology. Indeed, Marxist protestations to the contrary bespeak more towards an infighting among leftist ideologies. Merriam-Webster defines free market as, quote, "an economy operating by free competition," unquote. Admittedly, this is a rather simple definition. More detailed definitions will aid in analysis. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a free market is defined as, quote, "an economic system in which prices are determined by unrestricted competition between privately owned businesses," unquote. This is a clearer definition, yet it still leaves out key details that are needed to understand the concept. According to Investopedia, quote, "the free market is an economic system based on supply and demand with little or no government control. It is a summary description of all voluntary exchanges that take place in a given economic environment. Free markets are characterized by a spontaneous and decentralized order of arrangements through which individuals make economic decisions," unquote. A key aspect of free markets that is alluded, though not directly stated, in these definitions is an absence of coercion or force. In a truly free market system, no one can use violence or the threat of violence to influence the decisions of consumers, workers, or employers. Using these definitions, one will clearly see that in both deeds and words, the fascists in all the countries under examination were against free market economics. The economic structures of the fascist regimes were heavily regulated and controlled. In part, this tendency towards central planning has a historical inheritance. This can be seen particularly in Japan. There's a long-standing cultural aversion in Japan towards business and money lending. This can be seen in the extremely rigid class structure that was enforced by the Tokugawa shogunate. Merchants were among the lowliest in the feudal hierarchy, below the peasant farmers and above the untouchables. As merchants grew wealthier than their daimyo and samurai superiors, there was a seething class resentment, in anger at uppity merchants who wanted to assert more influence beyond their proper station. In Japanese ethics, profit was denounced as, quote, "the result of exploitation," unquote. Usurers and moneylenders were deemed to lack sincerity. Besides these cultural imperatives, there were also state-enforced restrictions on free market activities. Throughout the Tokugawa shogunate, there were major restrictions on trade and market transactions. In one extreme example, it was a crime punishable by death for Japanese fishermen to build boats that were too large. Furthermore, the Japanese famously sealed themselves off from outside influences for 2 centuries. Only persons on official government business could leave the country. Any Japanese found leaving the country without permission could be put to death. These trade restrictions were lifted somewhat to allow the Dutch to dock a few times a year in only one port, Nagasaki. These extreme restrictions were only lifted following the arrival of Matthew Perry, who threatened the Japanese to open their ports to American trade by using the strength of 19th century steamships. Following this humiliation, the Tokugawa shogunate was dismantled. The emperor's authority was reasserted in the Meiji Restoration. After the Americans had forced their way in the door, the British, French, and Russians were soon to follow. As was discussed before, this was the moment the Japanese realized that if they wished to maintain their honor on the global stage, they needed to industrialize, and quickly. This, however, did not mean a loosening of government controls on the economy. The industrialization program was cultivated and directed at the behest of the Meiji reformers. Their excellencies, the men who acted in the name of the emperor. Their excellencies, quote, arranged the game and set the rules. They not only planned, they built and financed on government money the industries they decided they needed. A state bureaucracy organized and ran them, unquote. Under their direction and using state funds and state protections, railroads, banks, factories, and other forms of industrial infrastructure multiplied rapidly. While the Japanese were attempting to imitate their British and American rivals, their economy was in no way a free enterprise system. As Ruth Benedict notes, quote, Japan's statesmen judged that industrial development was too important to Japan to be entrusted to laws of supply and demand or to free enterprise. But this policy was in no way due to socialistic dogma. It was precisely the Zaibatsu who reaped the advantages, unquote. While these key industries were nominally in the hands of extremely wealthy industrial families, those families were selected carefully for their loyalty to the state and their friendships with government officials. They truly did profit handsomely from their state-funded and state-enforced monopolies. This is hardly a free market. As many have noted, public cost and private profit is one of the hallmarks of fascism. This economic structure continued in Japan during the reign of the militarists, especially in the 1920s and 1930s when they were gearing up for their conquests. Japan's industrial and economic focus was upon creating a nation that could field a powerful modern army in order to compete with its imperial rivals. As a result, the government economic plans tended to focus upon government and military interests first, and consumer goods second, if ever. Ruth Benedict writes, quote, instead of beginning with the production of consumer goods and light industry, Japan first undertook key heavy industries. Arsenals, shipyards, ironworks, construction of railroads had priority and were rapidly brought to a high stage of technical efficiency. Not all of these were released to private hands, and vast military industries remained under government bureaucracy and were financed by special government accounts, unquote. This kind of economic development was actually very similar to the government-directed economic development in the Soviet Union, as was observed by historian A. James Gregor. Indeed, rapid economic development was a major goal for every totalitarian regime, fascist and communist alike. But this will be discussed at length later. Suffice it to say here, the economy of Imperial Japan was anything but a free market capitalist system. The Japanese government exerted control over other aspects of the economy besides heavy industry. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the government of Japan heavily regulated and restructured the financial system, in particular with a series of bailouts of banks and other industries, as well as legislation like the Banking Act of 1927. Ever since 1882, Japan has had a government-sponsored and regulated central bank. The Bank of Japan's purpose was to, quote, issue banknotes and carry out currency and monetary control, unquote, and, quote, to ensure smooth settlement of funds among banks and other financial institutions, thereby contributing to the maintenance of stability of the financial system, unquote. The Bank of Japan allowed for the Japanese government to engage in massive deficit spending, much of which went to support Japanese imperial interests in Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria. This, combined with the removal of the gold standard, resulted in a widespread lack of fiscal discipline on the part of the government. Masato Shizumi, an economist with the Bank of Japan today, makes the argument that the only person who acted as a bulwark against ballooning spending was the finance minister, Korekiyo Takahashi. Takahashi advocated for balancing the budget through cutting spending, particularly funding for the military. It was for this reason that he was assassinated by the militarists in February of 1936. It is argued that because of these various policies, Japan could be described as, quote, a pioneer in Keynesian economics, unquote, and avoided the worst aspects of the Great Depression. Regardless of the contention about the effectiveness of these policies, they are nevertheless not free market policies, and instead relied heavily upon government interference and regulation. Italy, likewise, entered into the industrialized world with heavy government support and regulation. Italy, like Japan, wished to assert itself as equals to their Western European neighbors, particularly following their unification in 1861. Throughout the 19th century, private capital was scarce. As such, industrialists in the North relied upon heavy government investments in various heavy industries, particularly manufacturing and the railroad. One organization that supported and advocated for government intervention was the Confindustria. Founded in 1910, the Confindustria was, quote, the main association representing manufacturing and service companies in Italy, unquote. The organization still exists today. Both the industrial North and the agricultural South in Italy lobbied for and relied upon protectionist tariffs to guarantee their competitive price points. Mussolini's fascist regime continued these protectionist and interventionist policies. The fascists attempted to continue or extend these policies through a variety of state or state-backed apparatuses. These included the Istituto per la Ricostruzione Industriale, the Fascist Syndical Confederation, the Confindustria, the Confederation of Professions and Artists, the Ministry of Corporations, the National Council of Corporations, the Superintendency of Foreign Exchange and Commerce, among many, many other organizations. The goal was to achieve a heavily regulated, centrally planned market economy that would be dominated by the fascist regime. One of the first major economic campaigns that the regime engaged in was the so-called Battle of Grain. Beginning in 1925, the Italian government imposed massive tariffs on grains and other agricultural products. The result of the policy was, quote, a domestic price well above the world market, unquote. Connected to these agricultural policies, the fascist regime also set out to drain marshes and build irrigation under the Bonifica Integrale, the Integral Land Reclamation Program. The government spent vast sums in these projects, only to have 58% of the reclamation projects completed, only 32% of the irrigation projects were finished. Government controls were also extended to heavy industries, particularly those deemed essential for war production. Rather than engaging in an outright confiscation of private assets, as was the case in the USSR, the Italian fascists engaged in a program of cartelization, wherein the remaining near monopolies would be beholden to the state. A 1932 law gave companies that controlled 70% of, quote, production in a given branch of industry or agriculture, unquote, an option to make a cartel with the backing of the state. Another law passed on January 12, 1933, quote, required firms that planned expansion of facilities or construction of new plants to obtain prior consent, unquote. 11 days later, the regime established the IRI on January 23, 1933. Through various policies, the IRI took over controlling interests in dozens of privately owned corporations. Quote, by 1939, 70% of pig iron production, 45% of steel, 80% of naval construction, almost all shipping, and parts of the electrical and telephone industries were in the hands of the state. Unquote. Nominally, these organizations were still private, for-profit companies. Yet, it was the regime that dictated policy. It was a form of nationalization by another name. Mergers of major corporations skyrocketed in the late 1920s. At the behest of the fascist regime, by 1932, only 144 corporations controlled 51.7% of corporate capital. The process of cartelization of major industries only accelerated as Italy shifted to a war footing. Oil, coal, tin, copper, nickel, synthetic fuels, rubber, steel, all fell under the purview and control of the central government. Meanwhile, major corporations like the chemical producer Montecatini grew rapidly under the auspices of the necessity of war production. Montecatini was an empire unto itself, comprising 43 smaller firms, 188 plants, and 64,000 workers. Italy experienced a rather quick industrial growth in the early 20th century. In the period between 1901 to 10, heavy industry made up 23.4% of the national income. Under the fascists, in the period between 1931 to 40, it had grown to 32.8%. These figures also corresponded with a marked decline in agriculture as a percentage of national income. Similarly, the service sector grew from 30% in 1901 to 10 to 37.4% in 1931 to 40. During the same time frame, it had declined from 46.6% in 1901 all the way to 29.8% in 1931 to 40. In part, due to these economic shifts, the fascist regime restricted internal movement. The rights of farmers and agricultural workers were limited so as to alleviate unemployment in the industrialized cities. Quote, to curb this phenomenon, the government gave powers to the prefects in 1928 to return those without means of support to their place of origin. In 1931, instructions went out to all the prefects of Rome and Milan to apply all regulations limiting legal changes of residence, unquote. These policies were highly unpopular among nearly every sector of Italian society, and as a result, the government eventually walked these policies back. However, it must be noted that the attempt to limit Italians' rights to movement had been made in earnest. Besides agriculture and heavy industry, the fascists also sought to control the banking system for their own purposes. The banking reform of 1936 essentially nationalized the banking industry. The Bank of Italy, which had been a private entity, became a state institution. The regime also established other banks, like the Banca Commerciale, all of which, quote, becoming publicly owned banks of national interest, unquote. Throughout the entire time period that the fascists had control of Italy, government spending ballooned out of control. Quote, expenditures for public works rose from 1/8 to 1/4 of total spending between 1929 and 1933, unquote. The trend only accelerated throughout the 1930s. In 1937, the government spent 16 billion lira, a budget that was 8 times the size of the 1934 budget. Yet it was not just preparations for war that the government spent money on. The Italian government also contributed money towards, quote, family subsidies in 1934, sick pay increases from 1928 to 38, year-end bonuses in 1938, paid national holidays in 1938, unquote. One result of all these policies of economic planning was a degradation in terms of the lives of average people. For one thing, fascist agricultural policies sought to achieve autarky in terms of grain, but starkly affected the production of fruits, vegetables, olives, and livestock. In 1928, over 1 million cows perished, their meat going uneaten. The agricultural policies saw, quote, a decline in the quality of the average Italian diet, unquote, all while it benefited entrenched economic interests with political pull. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, there were, quote, rising unemployment, shortened hours, and cuts in hourly pay, unquote. As a result, there was, quote, a steady decline in the consumption of meat, fruit, vegetables, butter, sugar, wine, and coffee. Between 1929 and 1933, unemployment tripled. Over 1 million Italians struggled to find work. The fascist regime famously suppressed labor unions, particularly those with a penchant towards Marxist or communist ideologies. In the earliest days of the movement, the fascists harried, harassed, and assaulted labor unions that they deemed were in league with communism. This behavior continued when the fascists took power. A 1926 law outlawed strikes. By the time that all opposition to the regime had been made illegal, so too did any oppositional labor unions. Arguably, this is part of the reason why many define fascism as inherently right-wing. However, it must be noted that this did not make the fascists opposed to labor unionism per se. Rather, the fascists supported their own labor unions that were loyal to the state. One of the largest of these fascist labor unions was the Confederazione dei Sindacati Nazionali, formed in 1922 with the active participation of Edmondo Rossoni, a labor organizer that had worked with the American industrial workers of the world. Immediately before the March on Rome in 1924, the fascist labor unions had 500,000 members. By 1927, Rossoni's organization had 2.4 million members. In October 1925, the Confindustria and the Fascist Syndical Confederation, at the behest of Mussolini himself, came to an agreement under the Palazzo Vidoni Accord. The agreement between state-supported industry and the fascist labor unions essentially gave, quote, exclusive bargaining rights to the fascist unions, unquote. A similar agreement, the 1927 Charter of Labor, quote, set forth the principle that relations between labor and management were to be governed by collective contracts worked out between legally recognized organizations, unquote. All of these policies taken together, the centralization and cartelization of key sectors in the economy and society, the heavy regulation of these sectors, tying them all together for the sake of a centrally determined national plan, was often referred to as syndicalism by the Italian fascists. But a better term for it would be corporatism. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines corporatism as, quote, the theory and practice of organizing society into corporations, subordinate to the state. According to corporatist theory, workers and employers would be organized into industrial and professional corporations, serving as organs of political representation and controlling to a large extent the persons and activities within their jurisdiction, unquote. The fascist ideal of all society divided into circles within circles, all of which revolved around the whim of the regime. These policies certainly benefited a very few well-connected businessmen, forming a kind of parasitic and incestuous relationship of cronyism. Yet, it would be a mistake to say that the fascist government was beholden to corporate interests. Far from it. Fascist policies often made Italian companies uncompetitive on the global market. Even if, at the beginning, corporate interests had believed that they could control the clown, Mussolini, they quickly found that they were more at the beck and call of the government than the other way around. Historian Alexander de Grand sums this up quite succinctly when discussing fascist adventures in Ethiopia and Greece. He writes, quote, heavy industry had to great a stake in the existing system to rebel against it. Supposedly safe in their fiefdoms, the industrialists found themselves with less and less control over the main lines of fascist foreign policy, unquote. Much the same could be said of the fascist domestic policy. None of this, of course, is indicative of a free market operating in fascist Italy. Rather, It is all indicative of a centrally planned and government-controlled economy, albeit one that is very poorly managed. The Italian fascists abhorred free markets. The competition involved in the enterprise invariably undermined national unity and subverted national goals. Palmieri wrote of competition, saying, quote, "Open competition, if not wisely directed and restricted, actually destroys wealth instead of creating it." Similarly, Germany's industrial and economic development was not the result of unfettered laissez-faire markets. It was heavily influenced by government policies. Protectionist tariffs favored monopolies, subsidies to mines, railroads, and factories. Add to all these, one can also observe the Bismarckian socialism further undermines a truly free market in Germany. The Nazis would continue and expand upon these anti-free market policies. Nazi economic policies pervaded into every aspect of society. Every economic sector, from agriculture to heavy industry, was heavily regulated and heavily controlled by state dictate. The rights of farmers were strongly curtailed by the Nazi government. The property rights of farmers were limited under the 1933 Reich Entailment Farm Law. Farmers were no longer allowed to dispose of their land as they wished. Farmers and other agricultural workers were also not allowed to leave rural areas without state permission. The 1934 Law for the Regulation of Work Allocation directly prevented farmers from leaving their farms to look for work in urban areas. A year later, yet another law limited the freedoms of farmers. Under the 1935 Law for Meeting Labor Requirements in Agriculture, required by law that former farmers that had gotten industrial jobs return to their former agricultural careers. These policies, along with many other agricultural policies dictated by the Reich food estate, were meant to foster, quote, "the organization of agricultural production," unquote, an organization that would be dictated by and for the purposes of the state. Nazi economic central planning also applied very directly and very strictly to the heavy industries. As part of their rearmament program, Germany established the Reichswerk Hermann Göring in 1937. The Reichswerk was a massive steel and armaments corporation whose assets amounted to 3.1 billion marks, quote, making it the largest industrial combine in Europe, unquote. By the end of 1940, the Reichswerk employed over 500,000 people and consumed, quote, most heavy industry and raw material production, unquote, in Germany. The Reichswerk was the largest industrial firm in Nazi Germany. The sole focus of the organization was doing the bidding of the Nazi regime. The Nazi government also imposed strict limits upon all commercial endeavors. One of the policies that the Nazis enforced was the dividend law of 1934, which strictly limited rates of profit to 6%. Firms were required to either reinvest anything over that limit back into their businesses, or otherwise it would be forfeit to the state. Another way that businesses were regulated was in terms of how they compensated their employees. The Nazis had established a minimum wage laws, and the 1934 law on national labor caused hourly wages to be fixed at depression levels. Taxes remained, quote, at the high emergency levels set during the Depression, unquote. In 1930, tax revenue was, as a percentage of the GDP, was 12.5%. A decade later, it was 23.1%. Tax revenue nearly doubled. These and other regulations led to a massive contraction in consumer spending in Germany throughout the Nazi regime. In 1932, the various consumer industries of Germany made up 40% of all capital investment. 6 years later, consumer investment had dropped by 23%. In 1938, only 17% of all capital investment was devoted to consumer industries. Similarly, in 1932, consumer industries made up 40% of all paid wages in the German economy. In 1938, it had fallen to 25%. In 1928, 69% of the German economy was made up of private consumer spending. In 1937, it was 56%. This contraction in consumption did not just apply to luxury goods, but also to various foodstuffs. Historian Richard Overy observes that, quote, between 1927 and 1937, there was a sharp fall in the consumption of higher value or imported foodstuffs. 44% less wheat bread, 18% less meat, 37% less fruit, 41% fewer eggs, while standard foods high in carbohydrates, such as potatoes or rye bread, were consumed in greater quantities, unquote. This massive contraction of private consumer spending in the German economy did not bother the Nazi government in the least bit. It did not matter to them that the German people had less comforts to buy with their hard-earned marks. Hermann Göring commented on this, emphasizing the importance of government-supported heavy industry. Quote, "Ore has always made a strong state. Butter and margarine have at the most made people fat," unquote. Erich Neumann, a Nazi official that played a critical role in the Nazi four-year economic plans, echoed Göring's sentiment. In 1941, Neumann stated that, quote, "Before we can begin to favor consumption, the fundamentals of national economy will have to be reestablished and permanently secured. Guns instead of butter is the watchword," unquote. Every single aspect of the German economy was under the regulation, control, and interest of the Nazi regime. Beginning in the 1930s and coming to fruition in the 1940s, in Nazi Germany, quote, "not a single business or farm would be independent of the central apparatus," unquote. Everything was to be regulated by the state. At the height of the Nazi regime, quote, "the German government was the largest single customer of all goods in the German economy," unquote. Part of the reason for this was that in many ways, economics was not respected as its own field of study. Whenever economics contradicted the Nazi ideology, it was economics that was required to step down. Hitler wrote about this in Mein Kampf, when he was discussing the economic collapse of Germany during and following World War I. Quote, "Only when it is understood that here, too, economics is only of second or third-rate importance, and the primary role falls to factors of politics, ethics, morality, and blood, will we arrive at an understanding of the present calamity, and thus also be able to find the ways and means for a cure," unquote. Free markets did not exist in any of the fascist regimes under discussion. It did not exist in Imperial Japan, nor in Fascist Italy, nor in Nazi Germany. All of them were centrally planned, government-controlled, top-down economic hierarchies that eschewed private spending in favor of government expenditures, subsidies, and controls. Arguably, the fascists merely represented an economic trend amongst the industrialized nations in the early 20th century. There was a rash of popularity and support for central planning schemes during this time period, a trend that was represented by not only the fascists, but also communism and progressivism. Many of the fascist regimes were praised for their economic policies. Many progressive observers wished to emulate them. H.G. Wells was one of the best-known members of the progressive movement. The renowned author of The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine was also a devotee of social, economic, and political reform. In 1936, Wells worked closely with filmmaker Alexander Korda to produce the film Things to Come. The film depicts a state of technocrats forcibly reforming global society towards rational ends, thereby saving the human race. In their review of the film, Action, the newspaper of the Union of British Fascists, humorously asked, "Is Mr. Wells a secret fascist?" Wells was far from the only progressive whose views, particularly on economics, coincided with the fascists. Many others joined him. Many American journalists observed the early days of the regimes with bemusement. The admiration was not one-sided. The fascists often looked to the progressives for inspiration. The economic policies invoked in the fascist regimes were very similar to ones advocated by John Maynard Keynes. boosting aggregate demand through increased government spending. Many have observed of Keynesian economics that it would work quite well within the context of a dictatorship. Before moving forward, it should be noted that one of the key differences between communism and fascism is that fascism allowed for a limited amount of private property and market transactions, whereas the communists attempted to do away with such institutions. Arguably, this is the key reason why many Marxists and communists claim that fascism defended capitalism. However, it must be noted that the fascists allowed for an extremely limited and highly regulated form of private property. Kita Iki noted this. In his essay, he gave 4 separate reasons why maintaining private property and private enterprise was desirable. However, he is clear that it is limited private enterprise. Iki advocated that the personal property be limited to 3 million yen per family and that businesses be limited to 10 million yen. Anything over these limits ought to be confiscated by the state. Quote, those enterprises that exceed the ceiling on private enterprises will be consolidated and managed by the state. Unquote. Similarly, Hitler wrote about the importance of private property, but primarily because it was a remnant of German cultural identity. Hitler's conception of private property was intrinsically tied up with his anti-Semitism and his distrust of international finance. Corporate ownership of property was not true Volkisch property ownership. Rather, according to Hitler, it was a tool of, quote, unscrupulous Jewish businessmen, unquote. Private property existed in Nazi Germany, but in name only. Economist George Reisman observes, quote, in Nazi Germany, private ownership of the means of production existed in name only under the Nazis, and the actual substance of ownership of the means of production resided in the German government. For it was the German government, and not the nominal private owners, that exercised all of the substantive powers of ownership. It, not the nominal private owners, decided what was to be produced, in what quantity, by what methods, and to whom it was to be distributed, as well as what prices would be charged and what wages would be paid, and what dividends or other income the nominal private owners would be permitted to receive. Unquote. No totalitarian system could ever respect private property rights, let alone free market economics. There were a number of reasons why the fascists were opposed to free markets and instituted strict government regulations on every aspect of the economy. Many of these reasons can be traced back to other core tenets of fascism as an ideology. Fascist populism was a key reason for these anti-free market policies. An inherent distrust of big business, international capital, or of established elites informed much of the philosophy and decisions of the fascist regimes. As was discussed earlier, in Japan, there had been a long-standing cultural attitude that abhorred merchants, businessmen, and the very idea of profit. This cultural attitude traces itself back to the feudal structure of Japanese society under the Tokugawa shogunate. The virtuous upper class, the daimyo and the samurai, prided themselves in their austerity, while the lower-class merchants flaunted their greed by amassing great wealth. Though the merchants became wealthier than the daimyo and the samurai, they were nevertheless socially ostracized, far lower than even the poorest peasant. As Japan dismantled the feudal structure during the Meiji Restoration, and as the zaibatsu became more prominent, the cultural attitudes largely stayed the same, a widespread distrust of the so-called aristocracy of finance. It was asserted by many that the aristocracy of finance held undue influence over the government and represented growing corruption and a flaunting of Japanese values. This view was held in particular by many in the Japanese military, whose recruits were largely drawn from the poorer rural areas of Japan. Kita Iki broadly represented this distrust in his outline plan for the reorganization of Japan. As discussed previously, Iki directly advocated for limits on private and corporate wealth, as well as nationalization of large businesses or the outright appropriation of the wealth of upper-class families. Those who had their property so appropriated would not be compensated by the government. In part, Ikkei justifies this course of action insofar as the wealthy had gained their wealth through the exploitation of the poor, and that economic gains were the product of the nation at large and not just particular individuals. Ikkei writes, quote, "The reason for not giving compensation to the present big capitalists and big landlords for the appropriation is that these few people have been able to accumulate this wealth, which is actually the product of common social progress and common production because of an iniquitous system." Unquote. In order to enforce such actions, Ikkei advocated that those who resisted should be put to death as a warning to others. If the Japanese government did not do so, it would be tantamount to anarchy. Ikkei writes, quote, "If the sole purpose of the state is to ensure peace and order among the people, then the capitalists who continually threaten the people must be curbed by the state. And if it does not do this, then it is tantamount to there being no state." Unquote. Ikkei asserts that these policies were not only necessary in order to make Japan a stronger nation on the world stage, but also that it would act as a leveling of the playing field and lead to more happiness for the nation as a whole. Ikkei writes, quote, "The individual's freedom to act and seek enjoyment should not be dependent on private wealth." Unquote. Further, Ikkei asserts that these policies would not be targeted at the exploiting rich for the benefit of the whole. Would only be targeted at the exploiting rich for the benefit of the whole. Quote, "The middle and lower classes will not be inconvenienced in the least. Only the upper will be affected." Unquote. Not only were these class resentments represented in the domestic sphere of Japanese politics, but also on the international stage. A key motivation of Japanese imperialism was their purported anti-Western imperialism and a feeling that they were not being treated with the respect their storied nation deserved. The global haves were exploiting the global have-nots. This populist resentment of free markets and capitalism can be seen in Japanese propaganda posters from the Second World War. In this image, it shows the hand of a capitalist squeezing the blood out of American soldiers. It reads, "Capitalists demand red endlessly. It's your blood, doughboys, but more and still more is to be squeezed out." In this image, the Japanese are asserting that the United States and the Allies are only fighting the war in order to ensure the bottom lines of major corporations. The big business interests in the United States, France, and the United Kingdom do not care for the lives or well-being of the average Allied soldier. They are merely being squeezed dry to protect their profits, to continue exploiting not only the poor in the United States, but the poor countries that had become Western colonial holdings. A similar sentiment can be seen in the following Nazi propaganda poster titled "Kulturterror." There are many layers to this piece of propaganda. A Leviathan let loose upon Europe, a Frankenstein's monster of Americana leveling German cities to ash, a monstrous destruction of centuries of German culture, certainly referencing the horrific bombings of Dresden and other cities. What is important for the present discussion, however, is how this piece asserts that the interests of Jewish international business are helping to motivate America's war effort. According to this piece, the reason that the United States is only involved in the war to begin with due to the interest of international Jewish capital. The various ways that anti-Semitism played into Nazi anti-free market policies will be discussed in more detail later in these videos. Populism played a key aspect in promoting and justifying the Nazi command economy. In 1931, a Nazi economic program defined economy as, quote, "the property of the people," unquote. The program further stated that in order to protect this collective right, the state needed to have supreme authority. In an article for Der Angriff, Goebbels questioned the loyalty of, quote, "black, white, and red fat cats," unquote. This was a reference to the flag of the old German Empire. Goebbels further accused these conservative businessmen of exploiting the nation for their own benefit. Quote, You say fatherland, but when what you're talking about are percentages, unquote. Historian Richard Overy makes the following observation of Nazi economic planning and its connection to class enmities. Quote, state control became more extensive while there developed growing political pressure for a genuine people's economy, uncoupled from the narrow interests of the capitalist elite, unquote. In Italy, a similar populist strain can be seen, particularly within the context of their attempted syndicalist corporatist state. The fascists sought to restructure the economy that, in their minds, would benefit the nation as a whole, not just the top earners. Palmieri wrote, quote, more important than the production of wealth is its right distribution which must benefit in the best possible way all the classes of the nation, hence the nation itself, unquote. Furthermore, under the syndicalist corporatist structure of social circles within circles orbiting around the state, the Italian fascists sought to lessen class conflict. Palmieri writes, quote, class war is avoidable and must be avoided. Class war is deleterious to the orderly and fruitful life of the nation, therefore it has no place in the fascist state, unquote. Class conflict led to a splintering of the nationalist unity the fascists sought to obtain. This is part of the reason why the Italian fascists harassed and assaulted opposing labor unions in the 1920s, and why fascists as a whole were opposed to Marxism and communism. According to the communists, class collaboration was not a viable option and would invariably lead to petty bourgeois trade unionism. According to the communists, class collaboration would only lead to a continuation of the capitalist order. Vladimir Lenin wrote in 1917, quote, the crisis is so profound, so widespread, of such vast worldwide scope, and so closely bound up with capital itself, that the class struggle against capital must inevitably assume the form of political supremacy by the proletariat and semi-proletariat. There is no other way out, unquote. Free markets could not be allowed to exist in the fascist regimes because it would fundamentally undermine the totalitarian mission of the fascist state. Under the totalitarian project, every aspect of a person's life must be controlled, regulated, and directed by the state. By necessity, this control must include every aspect of an individual's economic decisions. Alfredo Rocco writes, quote, freedom, therefore, is due to the citizen and to the classes on condition that they exercise it in the interest of society. What I say concerning civil liberties applies to economic freedom as well. Fascism does not look upon the doctrine of economic liberty as an absolute dogma. On the contrary, it considers the economic development and especially the production of wealth as an eminently social concern, unquote. The freedom of the citizenry was not a given. The freedom of the people must be used responsibly. As Rocco notes in the above quotation, this sense of social responsibility must apply to both civil liberties as well as economic liberties. Furthermore, what is and what is not socially responsible must be defined by the state itself, since the state represented the will of the people and thus the community. The Nazis described this people's community as Volksgemeinschaft, quote, a racially unified and hierarchically organized body in which the interests of individuals would be strictly subordinate to those of the nation, unquote. A person's individuality must be sacrificed for the advancement of the nation, the Volk, the state as a whole. The individual good was inherently lesser than the common good in totalitarian regimes. This sacrifice of individuality must, of necessity, apply to a person's economic freedom. In part, this is because, according to the fascists, no individual has created his wealth on his own. The idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps is nonsensical. Society and the state itself enabled the individual to create his wealth. He did not manifest it on his own. Palmieri writes, quote, private wealth belongs not only to the individual, but, in a symbolic sense, to the state as well, unquote. Not only is wealth not created by individuals acting independently, wealth can only be truly created when the efforts of individuals are coordinated by a central plan. Palmieri writes, quote, "True economic progress can derive only from the concerted effort of individuals who know how to sacrifice their personal egoism and ambitions for the good of the whole," unquote. However, greedy individuals almost never recognize this social interaction. They tend to act selfishly and greedily to the detriment of the community as a whole, a threat to the Volksgemeinschaft. Individuals must not be permitted to act in a selfish manner that would endanger the broader community. Rocco writes, "Fascists make of the individual an economic instrument for the advancement of society, as an instrument which they use so long as it functions and which they subordinate when no longer serviceable," unquote. The individual is a tool that must be shaped, tuned, and calibrated by the state in order to benefit the community as a whole, not just the greedy, ambitious ambitions of selfish individuals. The economy must be responsibly managed. Palmieri writes, quote, "Economic initiatives cannot be left to the arbitrary decisions of private individual interests," unquote. These sentiments were not only expressed by the Italian fascists. Quote, "Capitalism," Hitler announced to an early party rally, "has to become the servant of the state and not its master," unquote. In order to benefit the people, the economy must be shaped to benefit the nation. In order to benefit the nation, the economy must be dominated and controlled directly by the state. Every aspect of economic life must be controlled, dictated, and regulated. Palmieri writes about the extent of this state control. Quote, "The proper function of the state in the fascist system is that of supervising, regulating, and arbitrating the relationships of capital and labor, employers and employees, individuals and associations, private interests and national interests. This means that there cannot be any single economic interest which are above the general economic interests of the state. No individual economic initiatives which do not fall under the supervision and regulation of the state. No relationships of the various classes of the nation which are not the concern of the state. We see thus the fascist state resolutely enter the economic field to dictate what shall be from now on the relationship between capital and labor, employer and employee, landowner and farmhand, industrialist and worker," unquote. All of society is divided into politically relevant circles. Those circles must orbit around the state. All of society must be coordinated towards the ends of the people's community, what the Nazis referred to as Gleichschaltung. Towards these ends, it was necessary for the government to intervene directly and whenever they saw fit to benefit the people. Palmieri writes, quote, "The state may at any time that it deems fit, or that the need requires, intervene within the economic life of the individual to let the supreme interests of the nation have precedence over his private particular interests, even to the point where his work, his savings, his whole fortune may need to be pledged, and if absolutely necessary, sacrificed," unquote. The fascists sought to control every aspect of the nation's economic life, to coordinate it and guide it towards their own particular goals and ends. The fascist regimes utilized various policies in order to subvert free markets in order to build their totalitarian society. Kita Iki, as was discussed earlier, directly advocated for individual and corporate wealth being limited by state decree. Not only did he advocate for these legal limits, Iki also advocated that those who resist be put to death. Iki writes, quote, "If there is someone who seeks to violate this law, he will be seen as bringing into contempt the authority of the emperor and endangering the fundamental principles of the reorganization of the nation. The crime of endangering the emperor and that of rebellion against the nation will be enforced during the period of martial law, and for such crimes the death sentence is administered. The death penalty is not something that is desirable, but seeing the death of one or two people, everyone will obey," unquote. Hitler, in many ways, agreed with these sentiments. violence and intimidation could be utilized by the state in order to further the goals of the Volk. Hitler once wrote that, quote, "The surest means to beat inflation was to be sought for in our concentration camps," unquote. Furthermore, the Nazis would have agreed with Icky's conviction that those who resist or otherwise sabotage the state's economic policies ought to be punished. The punishment for economic sabotage can be seen in the example of German industrialist Fritz Thyssen. Thyssen, growing increasingly concerned about the power of the Nazi regime, fled to Switzerland in 1940. The Nazi regime, quote, "deemed his flight to be an act of economic sabotage and first sequestered, then nationalized his entire industrial fortune," unquote. He became a national pariah and his property taken from him. Thyssen warned about Germany's economic trends, saying in 1940, quote, "Soon Germany will not be any different from Bolshevik Russia. The heads of enterprise who do not fulfill the conditions of the plan prescribes will be accused of treason against the German people and shot," unquote. Thyssen was not the only German industrialist to be persecuted and intimidated by the regime. In 1937, a group of iron and steel industry executives met together to discuss their opposition to various government economic policies. Hermann Göring ordered that listening devices be placed in the meeting room. The entire meeting was clandestinely recorded without the executives' knowledge and without a warrant from the court of law. Göring then, quote, "sent all but one a telegram threatening them with prosecution for sabotage. To the one exception, he offered the prospect of a fat contract," unquote. While it was certainly true that some politically connected businessmen became wealthy from government contracts and government policies limiting competition, nevertheless, they were not equal partners. Business was expected to follow the interests of the state, not the other way around. The fascists also exerted immense control over the lives of average people. The day-to-day activities all over the country were regulated in order to forward political ends. In 1936, the Nazi regime passed a law stating that, quote, "all woolen clothes for men had to be made from at least 25% recycled material," unquote. A later law declared that, quote, "all uniforms produced for public service were to contain at least 50% of the newly developed artificial fibers, Zellwolle," unquote. These policies were passed not only in order to stimulate the burgeoning German industries in artificial fibers, but also acted as a means of forcing the citizenry to save resources for the future war effort. Another policy that furthered these ends and very clearly demonstrated the totalitarian nature of the German economy were laws that limited how many sets of clothing German citizens could personally own. Quote, "men could keep no more than 2 pairs of shoes or 2 suits of clothes. Police had the powers to search apartments and houses for hoarded clothing or metals. Concealment became an act of economic sabotage," unquote. Not only did the state seek to control what was in people's closets, they also sought to control what was in their garbage. Quote, "On 20 November 1936, a decree on kitchen waste ordered all households to save scraps and peelings," unquote. All the while, quote, "people were bombarded with state propaganda to save as a patriotic and prudential duty," unquote. German citizens were compelled to save for the sake of government spending. Banks were also forced by government decree to buy up government debt, short-term treasury bonds, for the purposes of rearmament. The fascists, in building their totalitarian system, sought to control every aspect of their subjects' lives, from the grocery store to their bank accounts, to their closets, to their table scraps. Nothing could be outside the purview of the state. All within the state, none outside the state, none against the state. In many ways, economic control is a necessary step towards creating a totalitarian system of government. Economist George Reisman observes, quote, "The requirements merely of enforcing price control regulations is the adoption of essential features of a totalitarian state, namely, the establishment of the category of economic crimes, in which the peaceful pursuit of material self-interest is treated as a criminal offense, and the establishment of a totalitarian police apparatus replete with spies and informers and the power of arbitrary arrest and imprisonment." Unquote. Economic control of any variety, fascist, socialist, communist, of necessity requires a totalitarian system to enforce its will, according to George Reisman. None of this, of course, favors or supports a free market economic system. Fascism's rejection of free markets was directly connected to its inherent antagonism to liberalism. The fascists viewed free markets and classical economics as being anathema to authentic human identity. Capitalists had reduced human beings to mere cogs in the economic machine, numbers on a ledger to be balanced. According to the fascists, the liberal emphasis on market economics dehumanized people and robbed them of their sense of self and pride. Mussolini writes, quote, "Fascism denies, that is, the equation of prosperity with happiness, which would transform men into animals." Unquote. Fascism argued that the individualism of liberalism would devolve into communism and anarchy, a hedonistic class war that would destroy all of society. This idea that liberalism inevitably would lead to communism is not only a reason that the fascists rejected democracy and liberalism, but is also a reason why they rejected free market capitalism. The seeds of communism lay buried in the soil of liberal free markets. Palmieri writes, quote, "Fascism, which is the very antithesis of individualism, stands as the nemesis of all economic doctrines and all economic practice of both the capitalistic and the communistic systems." Unquote. These philosophic contradictions would lead to the destruction of civilization must be countered. The excesses of capitalist greed must be curbed. According to the fascists, only the state could adequately counter the growing threat. Mussolini writes, quote, "It is the state alone that can solve the dramatic contradictions of capitalism. What is called the crisis cannot be overcome except by the state within the state. When one says liberalism, one says the individual. When one says fascism, one says the state." Unquote. Towards these ends, the fascists advocated that liberalism and free markets be removed from the equation for the good of society. The economy must be wrested from the hands of monopolistic capitalists and entrusted into the people's state. Hitler rejected, quote, "the free play of forces," unquote, in favor of the idea that, quote, "what was once accident must be planned," unquote. Hitler later stated that there be, quote, "a radical removal of all unrestricted economic liberalism," unquote. Furthermore, the fascists contended that liberalism was an anachronism in the modern day. Its ideas had been tested and they had been failures. Liberalism must be swept into the dustbin of history. The future belonged to the totalitarians. Hitler commented to Mussolini that, quote, "capitalism had run its course," unquote. Hjalmar Schacht was a German banker, economist, and financial expert. Beginning in 1933, he served as the Minister of Economics for the Nazi regime. In a 1934 speech, Schacht told an audience that, quote, "the age of economic liberalism in itself has gone for good," unquote. Liberalism was the past. Fascism is the future, and the future is now. As was discussed earlier, the fascists differed from the communists insofar as the fascists did not seek to do away with private property. On the surface, this could be interpreted as a point of agreement with liberalism. However, the fascists sought to decouple their concept of property from the liberal concept of property. Otto Ohlendorf was a high-ranking Nazi official. During the Second World War, he was made the direct commander of the Einsatzgruppen in southern Ukraine. The mobile death squads were responsible for over 1 million murders in the Soviet Union. Ohlendorf stood trial for his war crimes and was hanged in 1951. In 1935, Ohlendorf attempted to make the distinction between the fascist private property and liberal private property. Ohlendorf wrote that private property was not merely the unrestricted dominion over a good, as the liberals conceived of it, but was rather, quote, an obligation towards the community, enjoyed in trusteeship for the good of all, unquote. Fascism's disdain for liberalism was a key reason for its antipathy towards free markets. Given that nationalism is one of the key aspects of fascism as an ideology, it is only natural that nationalism is likewise a key reason as to why the fascists opposed free markets. As was discussed previously, the fascists argued that nationalism was not only a natural aspect of human organization, but the only form that could enable people's senses of identity. The nation was a holistic community. It was a people with a particular identity and culture. Anything that was a threat to the nation necessarily was a threat to the people. Anything that undermined nationalism necessarily undermined the people. In this regard, free markets and free trade were institutions that inherently undermined the nation. Free markets were inherently anti-nationalist, according to the fascists, because capitalists and businessmen were inherently greedy and individualistic. They would pursue their own bottom line, regardless of how it affected the national interest. Historian Richard Overy observes, quote, Hitler did not believe that the capitalist economy could be trusted to put these national priorities first, because capitalism was inherently egoistical, unquote. For the fascists, the economy must be structured around the interests of the nation, not the other way around. Hitler commented very directly on this idea. Quote, the nation does not live for the economy. It is finance and the economy, economic leaders and theories, which all owe unqualified service in the struggle for this self-assertion of our nation, unquote. Gleichschaltung, coordination of the entire nation must be achieved. Free markets undermine Gleichschaltung. The fascists, the Nazis in particular, made a distinction between productive and parasitic capital. Capitalists that ran factories that produced goods vital to the national interest were considered to be more acceptable than capitalists that became wealthy from merely shuffling money around. This is very similar to the Marxist idea of vampiric capital. In this regard, the fascists allowed for private property, but only insofar as it was productive towards the national interest. Richard Overy writes, quote, Hitler favored private ownership as a spur to creative competition and technical innovation, as long as it conformed to the national interest and as long as it was productive rather than parasitical capital, unquote. Capitalists would be allowed to exist so long as their greed did not undermine the national interest. Furthermore, the fascists believed that the world was a zero-sum game, a winner-takes-all gambit. In many ways, they echoed the old mercantilist line that believed that international trade always left one country with an upper hand and another country exploited. Quote, Hitler's own perception of economics was based on the idea that the well-being of one nation could only be secured by seizing the assets of another, unquote. This perspective translated very well into the Nazi ideas of Lebensraum and fascist militarism more generally. Adolf Hitler directly believed that international finance capitalism was the cause of World War I. A shadowy conspiracy of wealthy finance capitalists had provoked the war for their own nefarious ends. Hitler writes in Mein Kampf, quote, Today, the know-it-alls among our bourgeois politicians no longer laugh at us. Today, even they, insofar as they are not conscious liars, see that international stock exchange capital was not only the greatest agitator for the war, but that especially now that the fight is over, it spares no effort to turn the peace into a hell, unquote. Nazi ideology was riddled with this kind of conspiracism. a deep-rooted belief that a Jewish conspiracy was being plotted to not only enslave the world but also to destroy Germany. Any form of internationalism was laid at the feet of this Jewish conspiracy, so-called. One cannot discuss Nazism without discussing these deranged conspiracy theories. In this way, rather ironically, both Marxism and free markets are both considered to be international Jewish conspiracies to undermine the Aryan race, according to the Nazis. This can be seen very directly with the following image that shows communism and international capitalism walking hand in hand. Hitler himself wrote about this cooperation between the communists and the capitalists. While discussing the failure of the German Spring Offensive in 1918, Hitler makes the claim that the offensives were purposefully undermined by both communist labor unions as well as big business capitalists for their own purposes. Hitler writes, quote, "Thus the offensive was thwarted, the Entente saved, international capital was made master of Germany, and the inner aim of the Marxist swindle of nations achieved, to smash the national economy and establish the rule of international capital." Unquote. Hitler and the Nazis believed that Germany's loss in the First World War was entirely due to the weakness of civilian leaders and an international conspiracy to undermine German greatness. They were stabbed in the back, so-called. For Hitler, Germany's loss was a sea change. It was the culmination of a series of systemic contradictions that needed to be resolved before Germany could get back on its feet. Hitler writes, quote, "We more than deserved this defeat. It is only the greatest outward symptom of decay amid a whole series of inner symptoms." Unquote. Capitalist decay had led to Germany's defeat. It was a decay that the Nazis sought to purge. Nationalist antipathy towards free markets and free trade, and by extension hostility to capitalists, was inherent in the Nazi ideology from the beginning. In Mein Kampf, Hitler describes the first Nazi speech he had ever listened to. Hitler makes the claim that it was this speech that convinced him to become political and to join the Nazi Party. Hitler writes, quote, "As I listened to Gottfried Feder's first lecture about the breaking of interest slavery, I knew at once this was a theoretical truth which would inevitably be of immense importance for the future of the German people. The sharp separation of stock exchange capital from the national economy offered the possibility of opposing the internationalization of the German economy without at the same time menacing the foundations of an independent national self-maintenance by a struggle against all capital. The development of Germany was much too clear in my eyes for me not to know that the hardest battle would have to be fought, not against hostile nations, but against international capital." Unquote. This hostility towards free markets and an emphasis on economic nationalism continued to define the Nazi regime. It defined the Nazis not only in their actions, but also in how they conceived of themselves. Hitler writes, quote, "The fight against international finance and loan capital became the most important point in the program of the German nation's struggle for its economic independence and freedom. The only way to express Germany's greatness and independence, the only way to express the will of the people, the only way to establish a cohesive and holistic national community was to starkly oppose free markets." Very closely connected to the fascist emphasis on nationalism, economic nationalism particularly, was the concept of autarky. According to Investopedia, autarky, quote, "refers to the state of self-reliance, and it typically is applied to an economic system or nation characterized by self-sufficiency and limited trade. Fully autarkic states are those with closed economies and without any sources of external support, trade, or aid." Unquote. In order to achieve Gleichschaltung, the fascists eschewed international trade in favor of becoming economically self-sufficient. Hermann Göring stated that, quote, "We want to secure the existence of the German people, independent of all crises in the world." Unquote. This also played into fascist imperial ambitions. In order to achieve autarky, they needed territory and resources. As Hitler stated in 1941, quote, "What one needs and does not have, one must conquer," unquote. Foreign trade was strictly controlled in Nazi Germany. Numerous hurdles and regulations were put in place in order to protect German industry. Historian Richard Overy observes, quote, "All importers and exporters needed a license for each foreign trade transaction. They had to apply through one of 17, later 20, control offices, which, like the Soviet corporations, were each responsible for a single product range. The system was exploited ruthlessly to ensure that those goods essential for the regime's policies of rearmament and heavy industrial development were preferred," unquote. Very similar to the protectionist policies of the French and British empires in the 16th and 17th centuries, the fascists sought to limit imports. The fascists did not want their nations to become dependent on foreign economies. The goal of autarky was the express purpose of fascist economic policy. Part of the way that the Nazis sought to achieve this autarky as well as Gleichschaltung was through the use of top-down economic planning. These four-year plans dictated every aspect of the German economy. The particulars of these plans will be discussed later, but for now it must be noted that the inherent connection between these economic plans and the goal of autarky. The first four-year plan in Nazi Germany included massive government subsidies to private companies for the express purpose of achieving autarky. Over 8 billion marks were spent, which amounted to over half of all industrial investment between 1936 and 1940. Nazi Germany sought to become economically independent from the rest of the world so that nothing could stop their ambitions. The goal of autarky is an inherently totalitarian venture. It requires that every aspect of an individual's life is controlled by the state. What products they buy, where they are manufactured, what materials the products are used in the manufacturing. Autarky, by necessity, must limit free trade and thus free markets. A key aspect of the goal of autarky and the goal of Gleichschaltung was fascist military ambitions. From the very beginning, each of the fascist regimes sought to expand their territorial holdings through violence. Thus, their entire economies were reshaped and geared towards the production of war materiel. Quote, "The economy was a primary instrument for waging war. It had to be reshaped entirely to avoid another defeat. They structured a defense-based economy," unquote. These policies were inherently counter to the mechanisms of the free market. In Italy, throughout the late 1930s, the fascist regime prepared for war. A key part of their war preparations was heavy regulation of agriculture, stockpiling needed supplies to feed their soldiers. While Germany had a strong industrial base, the experience of World War I demonstrated that they were at a severe disadvantage when challenging the vast empires of France and Britain. Further, the experience of the turnip winter of 1916, wherein 700,000 people starved to death, showed the perilous need of stable agricultural resources. Hitler, reflecting on these facts, once said, quote, "The only remedy lay in the acquisition of more living space," unquote. Lebensraum. This living space could only be acquired through force. Quote, "War was the instrument for providing the German people with the economic resources they could not acquire under the conditions of a failing capitalist system," unquote. In order to acquire the needed territory, Germany needed to rearm. In order to rearm, Germany, the Nazis claimed, needed to achieve Gleichschaltung and autarky. Hitler tied all of these elements together when he said, quote, "Germany depended not only on building up armed forces larger than any possible combination of enemies, but on forcing the economy to accept its racial duty by eschewing all inessential tasks in favor of creating the foundation for large-scale war-making," unquote. Interestingly, Nazi territorial ambitions created a compounding and self-reinforcing cycle. Their plans for rearmament were so grandiose that by necessity, They needed to acquire more territory, particularly since they had eschewed international trade. Towards these ends, the Nazi regime took over vast swaths of the economy, raised taxes, increased regulations on businesses, massively increased government spending, issued massive subsidies to politically connected companies, imposed strict rations, and otherwise dictated the economic lives of Germans for nearly a decade. The Nazi regime invested billions into defense industries and other industries that were strategically necessary. Attempts to modernize the German army and air force, quote, required investment totaling 1.9 billion marks in 3 years, almost half of all investment in the capital goods industry, unquote. In the 1930s, the Nazi regime invested heavily in the production of aluminum, so much so that it became the world's largest aluminum industry, quote, 2/3 of whose output was used by the predominantly military aircraft industry, unquote. By 1939, over 70% of all industrial investments in Germany, quote, anticipated the waging of war, unquote. The restructuring of the German economy towards a war footing resulted in a massive contraction in consumer spending. Historian Richard Overy writes that, quote, by 1939, many German consumer industries were providing extensive quantities of goods for the armed forces: boots, uniforms, mess kits, paper, leatherwork, which were almost identical with the civilian product and which were counted for statistical convenience as civilian goods, unquote. Goods that otherwise would have gone to furnishing the desires of average Germans were instead redirected towards the armed forces. While Germany created one of the largest and most sophisticated armies in history, German citizens were not allowed to own more than 2 sets of clothing and had to do without butter and milk. An argument is often made that the fascists were capitalist because all the participants in World War II engaged in similar economic planning schemes. This can be seen in the United States, car manufacturers being converted to produce tanks and airplanes. This interpretation, however, disregards the fact that from the very beginning the fascists advocated for direct state intervention and control of the economy. The policies of rearmament merely accelerated the process. Historian Richard Overy explains, quote, military procurement did not cause the command economies, but the scale of defense outlays and preparation in the 1930s led to an intensification of control to ensure that current resources could be released into the defense sector at the expense of current civilian consumption, and to the conversion of existing civilian productive capacity to military use in war, unquote. Military spending accelerated government economic controls, but even if the fascist regimes had not acted upon their imperial ambitions, the goals of autarky and Gleichschaltung would invariably have led to vast state controls of the economy. The massive economic restructuring by government fiat, state controls for the purposes of war and conquest, have nothing to do with free markets or freedom in general. The goals discussed throughout this section, autarky, Gleichschaltung, military ambitions, all required top-down, state-driven economic planning. Furthermore, there was a persistent belief that modern economies were far too complicated to be left to the invisible hand of the free market. This belief that economic planning was necessary was often repeated by Adolf Hitler. In a 1935 speech to the Nazi Party's annual Congress, Hitler stated that, quote, without a plan, we will not come through, unquote. A year later, Hitler told the Congress that, quote, the lack of restraints of a free economy had to be ended in favor of planned direction and planned action, unquote. In a conversation in 1942, Hitler observed how the war effort was only possible through, quote, a planned economy from above, unquote, and that even when the war ended, it would be necessary to continue the planned economy, lest egoistic business interests undermine the national interest. These ideas of economic planning were put into effect through a number of government laws and institutions. The Nazi regime passed a law in February of 1934 that sought, quote, the organic reconstruction of Germany's economic system, unquote. It acted as a series of economic chambers and organizations, all under the purview of the Reich Economic Chamber. Other economic organizations and chambers that were not associated with the state-run chamber were abolished. 6 new economic chambers were created by the Nazi regime, quote, representing industry, commerce, handicrafts, banking, insurance, and energy supply, unquote. This kind of organization was then extended all the way down to the local level. On every level, in every industry, the Reich's economic plan was to take effect. In 1936, Hitler tasked Hermann Göring to develop a plan towards centralizing and regulating the economy for the express purpose of military buildup. This program was known as the 4-year plan. Göring was uniquely suited for this task. Göring, like Soviet economic planners, was largely blind to economic realities and limitations. All that he cared about was that his will be enforced. Hitler once praised him by saying that he was a man, quote, of unbending will, for whom the phrase, "it won't work," does not exist, unquote. Göring wholeheartedly believed in the necessity of the economic planning and in his ability to do so. In January 1937, in the first edition of the 4-year plan journal, Göring declared that he meant to utilize, quote, the unitary leadership and organization of the entire economy, unquote. In order to institute the economic plans of the regime, every aspect of the economy was put under the purview of Göring and his 4-year plan. Quote, there were 6 main divisions: raw material production, raw material distribution, labor, agriculture, price control, and foreign exchange, each with its own subdivision, unquote. Not only were products regulated, but the prices those products were sold for were also heavily regulated. Quote, the most important office was that of the Price Commissar, set up on October 29, 1936, unquote. The Nazis engaged heavily in price controls, price floors, and ceilings that facilitated their economic plans and invariably led to massive shortages. Investments in new businesses were strictly regulated. Germans had to ask for government permission before starting new businesses or investing more money into existing businesses. All of these proposed investment plans were to be reviewed by the state-run Reichsbank, and ultimately, quote, preference was given only to projects that complied with state priorities, unquote. What foreign trade was allowed was very strictly regulated and controlled. All foreign trade was deeply regulated by the state under what Schacht called the New Plan. State-run, top-down economic planning is inherently opposed to free markets. In no way can Nazi Germany be considered to be a free market system. Otto Ohlendorf described the Third Reich's economy as, quote, fully planned economic management, unquote, in which, quote, the state leads the economy, unquote. While the fascists were all very similar to one another in regards to their economic controls as well as their reasons for doing so, the Nazis had another unique reason for undermining free markets: their vicious anti-Semitism. Hitler made the claim that capitalism and free markets were inextricably linked to an international Jewish conspiracy, so-called. Hitler stated that, quote, the economic system of our day is the creation of the Jews, unquote. Nazi propaganda often reiterated hateful stereotypes of Jews being greedy moneylenders or heartless industrialists that exploited their workers. For the Nazis, stereotypes of Jews and stereotypes of industrialists were invariably one and the same. This can be seen very clearly in the image that has been predominant in this video. The caption of the image, "The Wire Puller," implies much about Nazi anti-Semitic beliefs. For one thing, the implication of the caption is that the workers, the common people, are the hapless puppets of wealthy industrialists. They are invariably tied against their will to the whims and the greed of their employers. Furthermore, the idea of wealthy Jews, quote, pulling the strings, unquote, is directly connected to Nazi conspiracism. The international Jewish conspiracy secretly puppeteered the governments and the economies of every major nation. Nazi anti-Semitism had a direct impact on Nazi economic policies. Nazi economic policies were utilized to further isolate Jews in Germany. The National Press Law created state censorship of the press and excluded Jews from journalistic positions. Their hereditary farm law prohibited Jews from inheriting farmlands. The law for the reduction of unemployment provided subsidies for couples wishing to marry if both the man and woman were deemed racially superior. This is merely a snapshot of the government policies that sought to economically isolate Jews. Further, this is merely a snapshot of the extent of Nazism's murderous hatred of Jews. The state using violence and law to directly exclude particular people from participating in the economy or the wider society is in no way an example of a free market policy. As has been demonstrated throughout this section, it should be undeniable that the fascists were viciously opposed to free markets and capitalism, not only in their rhetoric, but also in the policies that they pursued. Free markets stood in the way of all of fascism's goals. In Japan, the militarists sought to restructure their society in such a way that would be conducive towards their ideas of Shintoism, as well as their imperial ambitions. So doing would require flagrant attacks on free markets and upon businessmen and entrepreneurs. In so doing, they would bring about a modern, controlled economy and society. Kita Ikki writes, quote, "The first urgent matter for a movement by the Japanese beyond the boundaries of law, under the leadership of the emperor, will be to completely excise the privileged classes, both economically and politically, because of the worry within and the distress outside. The cause of all these troubles comes out of this tumor. Similarly, only by ending the economic feudal structure with its private economic armies will it be possible to bring about the internal economic unity of the state." The disdain that the Italian fascists held for free markets and for businessmen can be seen clearly near the end of the life of the regime. As the Allies were beating the Italians to a pulp and beginning to occupy the peninsula in force, the regime itself fled to areas in northern Italy that were dominated by the German army. It was here, under the protection of the Wehrmacht, where they established the short-lived Italian Social Republic. It was here, in the dying days of the regime, that they truly bared their fangs against capitalism and private property. The Italian Social Republic attempted to achieve the following goals. Quote, "Nationalization of public services and war industries was promised. Uncultivated land or land that was not being used productively was to be divided among day laborers or handed to farmer cooperatives. Social control in industry would operate by means of state ownership of key sectors and the establishment of management councils and profit sharing in the private sector. These plans were given substance in a decree law of February 12, 1944. All firms with a capitalization of more than 1 million lire were to be socialized." Unquote. Italy surrendered in 1943. As things became apparent that the fascist regime would fall, one of the first groups to turn on Il Duce were his supposed supporters in the business and industrial community. The businessmen of Italy had no love of the fascist regime. For the Nazis, nothing would stop the 1,000-year Reich, not even economics. Their will to power would subvert and overturn the laws of economics. Economics was of secondary importance when compared to the needs of the state and the needs of the Volk. Hitler stated as much in Mein Kampf. When discussing the economic collapse of Germany during and following World War I, Hitler wrote, quote, "Only when it is understood that here, too, economics is only of second or third-rate importance, and the primary role falls to factors of politics, ethics, morality, and blood, will we arrive at an understanding of the present calamity, and thus also be able to find the ways and means for a cure." Unquote. Hitler was as opposed to capitalism and to free markets as much as any communist was. Richard Overy, in his book The Dictators, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, engages in an extensive comparison between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, two historical figures who are supposedly on polar opposite ends of the political spectrum. Overy's observations about both dictators and their views on capitalism is worth quoting at length. Overy writes, quote, "Stalin and Hitler were both anti-capitalists. Both, from different vantage points, recognized the need to supersede the age of liberal or bourgeois economics with a new economic order. It was not necessary to be a Marxist in the 1920s to believe that capitalism produced class conflict, economic selfishness, and repeated slumps. Both dictators viewed the economy as a means to an end, but not an end in itself. Both regarded a healthy economy as the indispensable foundation for the achievement of other priorities, the construction of the social utopias, the military defense of the dictatorships, the achievement of social peace, a distant future age of perpetual prosperity." Unquote. As has been stated earlier, a key difference between the communists and the fascists was that the fascists allowed for private property, while the communists did not. However, it must be reiterated, for the fascists, private property was only allowed so long as it served the purposes of the state. In 1937, Hitler addressed the party Congress, in essence telling them, quote, "Private enterprise would be tolerated only as long as it conformed with the regime's objectives. Otherwise, the state would step in." Unquote. Gleichschaltung must be achieved through strict government planning and controls. Laws against economic sabotage were passed as early as 1936. Persons who were guilty of such sabotage could face being sent to prison or to the concentration camps. Such antisocial activities as black marketeering, smuggling, currency fraud, even unauthorized price rises, among other economic crimes, were punishable by long prison sentences or even execution. The Nazis deemed these economic crimes to be examples of sheer selfishness. Invariably, such economic controls led to shortages, unemployment, misallocation of resources, and a generalized deprivation among the citizens of the fascist regimes. The needs of the citizenry were inevitably curtailed in order to fulfill the state's plans. Richard Overy observes that, quote, "The emphasis on the physical construction of factories, canals, roads, military installations, and cities produced an accumulating crisis of overinvestment, a failure to ensure that the rest of the economy could supply enough labor, construction materials, and machinery to complete the projects on schedule." Unquote. Subversions of the free market and of free trade invariably lead to the creation of authoritarian or totalitarian political structures. This point was emphasized by economist George Reisman, but he was not alone in this assessment. German economist Arnold Müller-Armack, in his 1947 book, Managed Economy or Market Economy, observed that, quote, "Experiments in national economic management that dispensed with the mechanisms of free prices inevitably translated into a power mechanism of the authoritarian state, whose purpose was to mobilize economic resources to the maximum to meet political goals." Unquote. It should be inarguable from all of these examples that the fascists were inherently anti-free market.